Asha here.
It's Asha here.
Richard in the middle. Tonija here. And also here.
Ooh, my bad.
Oops, let you go around.
Thank you.
There we go.
Oh.
Good morning. Welcome. I'm Tom Carothers. I'm the director of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program at the Carnegie Endowment, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. Carnegie is marking and celebrating Black History Month. Black History Month, as I suspect some of you know, was first established in 1970. It built on a tradition of history weeks. They were at the time starting in the 1920s, called Negro History Weeks, but history weeks throughout much of the 20th century. But then after the flourishing of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, a push was made and was successful to establish a broader Black History Month. It was officialized in 1976 by President Gerald Ford as part of the bicentennial celebration in the United States. And so for over 50 years, it's been a time to note, to appreciate, to examine, and to celebrate the contributions of African Americans to American society, politics, diplomacy, culture, and economy. I don't need to tell any of the people here that African Americans have played a critical role in fighting for, and expanding American democracy across the long prairie of American democracy from the 19th century to the present. And they have also played a critical role in helping attach values to America's international engagement. And this connection between the fight for values at home and the fight for values in our international engagement is what we're going to be talking about today. And it's very much on our minds, given the current political moment in which the United States is, I would say, struggling under pressure to maintain adherence to and faith in our democratic values at home, and also in how we engage in, project, and respect values in our international engagements as well. So this intersection between domestic and international values is at the heart of the Black history perspective as seen by the Carnegie Endowment. It's very much on the minds of this country, I think, today, and it'll be our topic here. Now, we're very fortunate to have four great people to talk about that with. On my immediate left, Tonija Hope, who is the director of the Ralph J. Bunche International Affairs Center at Howard University, where she designs and implements the strategy of the center in its global engagement, its programming, its scholarship programs, its fellowships, and many highly useful activities in this community. She also brings to that job a really fantastic background, which I can't detail for you here, but involves time in South Africa and elsewhere, and really brings a rich array of experiences to the table. On her left, Richard Brookshire is the founder and the CEO of the Black Veterans Project, which seeks to redress the inequities in access to veteran benefits by Black Americans and others. He is an Army veteran, served in Vietnam as a combat medic. It's not in Vietnam, Freudian slip, I was talking about the 1970s. Afghanistan. You're not that old. I just gave you 30 years for free. In Afghanistan as a combat medic. And so he brings to his work in the Black Veterans Project a very real-life foundation of experiences. On his left, Asha Castleberry-Hernandez is many things. She's a noted public speaker. She's an author. She's a former congressional candidate. And herself, an Army veteran, who brings, again, a rich array of perspectives and experiences to foreign affairs and national security, in which she's an expert in many dimensions of it. So she also brings a lot to this conversation. Last, but by no means least, my colleague, Christopher Schell, who's a fellow in the American Statecraft Program, here at the Carnegie Endowment. Chris joined us several years ago, just gotten his PhD at Michigan State University, and he joined us to develop work on the role of African Americans in American foreign policy and American society, and he's been doing some wonderful work for us on that topic as well. The American Statecraft Program, which examines America's engagement in the world, is the host for today's event. Its director, Christopher Chivas, is with us right here. So we thank them for their commitment to this topic and look forward to the discussion. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to cover an interesting range of issues. Chris is a tough taskmaster. He's given me a long, detailed list of questions, which I need to present to the panelists. Some of them I have up here. Some of them I have in my pocket here. But I'm going to let's start by talking about historically Black colleges and universities and their role. I'm going to start with their role in diplomacy. And Tonija, I'm going to turn to you. If you could talk a little bit about the legacy of Ralph Bunche in American diplomacy, and then also bring it forward and talk about what is the role of your center and others like it, if there are others exactly like it, but others like it, in bringing Black Americans into the American diplomatic framework, engagement in the world, and so forth. So a bit about the legacy of Bunche, but then bring it forward to today.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Good morning, everyone. I think this is a really important topic of conversation. I don't think that people tend to think about historically Black colleges and universities as being kind of essential to the discussion or the evolution of foreign policy or international affairs. Ralph Bunche, as probably most people in this room know, was one of the co-founders of the United Nations. He was the founder of the political science department at Howard University before that. And I think those two things together have really kind of set the stage for Howard University and many HBCUs in terms of international engagement and involvement in international affairs and foreign policy. I think that HBCUs have a very important role to play. I'm not sure that every HBCU recognizes the important role that they play, but I hope that they will embrace that responsibility, especially right now. I think right now is key. The Bunche Center, we are kind of the nexus of international programs and activities at Howard University. You all are probably familiar with the Charles Rangel, Thomas Pickering, Charles Rangel, and Donald Payne fellowship programs well, as of right now, still in existence, but unfortunately, every day we're just expecting them to disappear. So that would be very unfortunate, considering the contributions to the U.S. Foreign Service at State and AID that those fellowships have made. So. But we administer them. We've been administering them for the last, each of them for different amounts of years, but for many years. And I think the data point is 1 in every 9 or 10 Foreign Service officers has come through that program, or Foreign Service officers of color, I'm not sure. And so it's really important that those programs remain. The diversity of perspectives that they provide and represent for our Foreign Service is key. And I think a lot of people recognize that. Unfortunately, people in power today are questioning it. So I hope that everyone acknowledges and recognizes the important role that those play. But then just the center and our programming, study abroad. I think people don't talk about study abroad enough as a stepping stone to all of these other international careers. And unfortunately, African Americans in particular do not study abroad at very high numbers. I think the last Open Doors report from IIE said 5.9% of the students that study abroad in the United States, only 5.9% are African American or Black. And so if in the long run we are trying to get more of us to fill different roles in international development or international in diplomacy, business, et cetera, and only 5.9% are having those international experiences, it's a problem. So from the Bunche Center, we're working really hard to address those numbers. We have a hashtag Study Abroad So Black. If you go to that on Instagram, you will see images of mostly Howard University students, but others out in the world. And we host an HBCU symposium on internationalization, which hopefully will encourage HBCUs to embrace their role in advancing international engagement and international affairs.
Let's get a couple of other perspectives on this. Richard, Asha, Chris, would you like to, on HBCUs in terms of their adding additional perspectives to international affairs for their students and their graduates? Yeah.
Yes, so I'm a product of, well, thank you for having me here. I'm a product of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. So I went through the defense route as far as learning about Black students' trajectory, in terms of their future in foreign policy, national security. And so at Hampton University, I was part of that wave right after 9/11 that joined. And the numbers were really low because many of us scared to go to war, like Richard and I. And that's one of the top feed-in mechanisms in terms of the officer corps, where Black officers are able to, join the military, and if they stay in for quite some time, they start to become part of the policy making, like routed to the Pentagon. So that's a great mechanism. That tends to have low visibility. I see a friend of mine who's awesome. He's a West Point grad here. And sometimes I see in the broader context of the Black community and also outside the Black community, when it's time to recognize Black soldiers or veterans, especially in the officer corps, it's like, thank you, West Point, for graduating the X amount of number of Black officers. But I don't see a thanks for HBCUs. And HBCUs have been for years, graduated a lot of officers, but very low recognition. And many of them are wonderful, wonderful, amazing alumni who have extraordinary experiences. Right now at Hampton University, our president, Lieutenant General Williams, me and him, we've deployed together in Kuwait and Iraq, and he has amazing experiences. And he has actually applies those experiences serving as the president. And also at the Pentagon under Defense Logistics Agency. So again, we should thank our HBCUs as far as not only through the diplomacy route, but also building out defense route too.
Chris, did you want to come in? Looks like.
Yeah, bringing it back to Howard, not just because I'm a Howard grad, but I guess from the intellectual side of things, you mentioned Ralph Bunche. I mean, he comes out of this Howard school of thought that seeks to internationalize the African American struggle for democracy. So not seeing it as just solely a U.S. experience or for African Americans to reach full equality as just something that's isolated to the contiguous borders of the United States, but really more so that it's intrinsically tied to decolonization, it's tied to other forms of inhumanity or systems of oppression. So that's critical towards, I think, the thought process that comes out of Howard. And I'm thinking about Ambassador Andrew Young, who's the first first African-American ambassador to the UN, and he served under President Carter and was influential and critical in kind of pushing forward Carter's humanitarian human rights agenda. So I think that school of thought that seeks to kind of internationalize African-American experience kind of pushes forward and is like a value add of human rights and looking for other areas where there are, you could say, disadvantaged individuals or people.
I'll add one point. I think that some folks look at HBCUs as kind of monolithic, just kind of they look at the Black community as monolithic. There's an international presence at HBCUs. My grandfather came from Haiti, went to Hampton, pivoting it back to Hampton,
Yes.
in the 1930s. So there is a plethora of folks from different countries at these institutions, adding value and perspective as well. They aren't just being attended by strictly African Americans.
Good. Richard, I want to stay with you and move to the veterans as an additional part of this picture. Obviously, African Americans have fought in every military conflict in modern American history. The American military was probably the first major institution in this country to finally erode Jim Crow segregation. And so there's a very fundamental role that African Americans have played in these American engagements in the world. Tell us a little bit about the work of the Black Veterans Project. What are some of your aims in addition to inequities and access to benefits, but there's something larger at work in your project. Tell us about what you're aiming for in terms of working on behalf of African American veterans.
So the Black Veterans Project was started to preserve the legacy of Black veterans' experiences, which we know now to be even more imperative because of the attack on just fundamental American history. But second is to push forward the case for repair, the case for reparations, thinking that the African-American Black experience, specifically and obviously in combat and returning home and not getting equitable access from things like the GI Bill to more modern day things like disability compensation, which have such an exponential effect on folks' ability to ascend to the middle class or to just attain some level of economic security. There hasn't been a reckoning around those inequities. And so we built a series of legal partnerships, one of the main ones being with Yale Law School, to FOIA the VA to force its hand to release race-based data. We were successful in that endeavor. For the first time in American history, the VA was forced to admit that there were, in fact, sustained and systemic racial disparities in benefits accessibility. That data is then being used to undergird a landmark case called Monk versus United States, which is making its way through the courts now. As of middle of last year, became one of the first reparative justice cases in American history to survive a motion to dismiss. Most of these cases get easily thrown out of court, or this case has not been thrown out of court. And even last week, there was another major victory with respect to that case, another legal challenge to try to get it thrown out of court. And this crosses different administrations. This is very much a nonpartisan issue. And yes, the military in many respects was the first institution to desegregate. But I would argue, the degree to which desegregation actually materialized is in question when you had the majority of military bases predominantly in the South, so named after Confederates, up until 2023, 2024. And now there's an effort to want to dial back the base renamings, let alone you talk about the infrastructure that was built around the Department of Veteran Affairs to deliver on the moral, social, and ethical contract that the government got into with folks who served, specifically Black folks who served, that they did not make good on, right? Mm-hmm. And you're talking about tens of billions, if not more, of dollars that have been siphoned out of the Black community because of a lack of a real conversation to engage with this history. And so we are building out a case for reparative justice around it.
Terrific. Asha, if I could come to you for a slightly more personal perspective, your own experience in the military. How would you say, it's kind of a big question, but how would you say it shaped your perspective on international affairs and America's engagement in the world?
Oh, yes. Well, again, I was commissioned during the Bush administration, so I learned a lot about counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. And then as a practitioner, when I was deployed in the Middle East. And so that shaped my perspective on just building allies and partners, counterterrorism work, security cooperation. And then I learned as a practitioner serving in uniform as a woman of color, a Black woman, that initially I thought DOD was crazy to send me to the Middle East to build relations with Arab Muslim service members and working on relationships. I didn't think I had the capability, the asset to make that happen. And I found out, no, I actually am an asset, not a liability. And so I learned as a frontliner that that I actually contribute significantly good work when it comes to, extraordinary work when it comes to building our allies and partners, right? And then also too, as far as my post 9/11 national security counterterrorism work, I learned that, we lack in terms of representation when it comes to, definitely when it comes to hard security versus soft, right? The harder the security is, the less we're represented. And we need to spread out and be part of that, type of work from bottom top, tactical, all the way up to strategic. And I still feel that in the 21st century, we struggle with representation from bottom up. And also, I value that type of experience when we start from the tactical level and work our way up. I meet a lot of people in this town that just want to go straight up to strategic, and their perspectives are very limited because they've never been out in the field to learn about national security. Now, going back to starting when I was first enlisted during the Bush administration, now going all the way up to here, to now the 21st century under Trump era, what I also learned is adjusting to the new dynamics when it comes to national security now shifting to strategic competition, right? Where now it's a state-to-state actor situation. It's not just about non-state actors in terms of countering our threats, our competition, or dealing with cooperation. And that was an adjustment, right? And for the entire community, regardless of who you are. And but then there's some continuity in terms of what you've learned in security cooperation. During counterterrorism, you can apply some of that in strategic competition. Well, I've acquired that type of perspective, and it's a hit or miss if people want to hear that, right? Because I, as a Black woman, sometimes people who have low expectations of thinking you have that type of perspective where you could do the comparative analysis, right? And it filters out. Some would like to hear my perspective, some will not, right? It doesn't matter. But anyway, for the most part, I just learned how to adapt from an era from counterterrorism all the way up to strategic competition. And it was quite fascinating to see that. Mm-hmm.
Good. We're going to come back to some work Chris has done and others in your perspectives on African Americans and their views of America's engagement in the world. But I want to actually turn to a specific issue, which is the Congressional Black Caucus. Some people have called the caucus the conscience of the Congress. And at a time when, particularly both with respect to domestic values, but also in terms of preserving values in America's international engagements, at a time when the question of those values is a subject of really tremendous debate right now in this country, is there a role for the Congressional Black Caucus in trying to preserve some sense of a valued, an American engagement based on values? Who would like to take a bite at that question? Yeah, okay.
Yes. Yes, there is. And actually, when it comes to foreign policy, they're engaged right now in many issues. They have been known to contribute a lot to, apartheid, countering apartheid, being part of the anti-movement, to now shifting to where their priorities have been focused on, immigration, CARICOM security, as well as building relations in Africa. So their scope is somewhat limited, but they're looking into growing it more. And one example of that is dealing with artificial intelligence. A lot of focus on cybersecurity issues. So they're adapting, right, as far as adjusting to this national security, foreign policy, 21st century agenda. And what you're seeing, I think, is the newer generation is more energized as far as in bringing in these new items in terms of what can we do with addressing, threats involving AI, right? I would say about 15 years ago, when it comes to asking the CBC, about national security topics, it's a hit or miss.
Yeah.
But now I see, new members want to be more part of it.
Chris, let me follow on question on that. since you wrote the question, it's a hard one. I'm going to give it to you. How might defending liberal internationalism connect to the struggles at home for a focus on climate change, a focus on immigration policy, on other forms of domestic policy that touch on values? And how do you think that connection can be drawn more?
For sure. I mean, when I think about the CBC and their engagement on foreign policy, I hate to say it, but in many ways, the CBC and just a lot of other intellectuals are engaged in foreign affairs when the situation domestically is rather unsettled. So where you see, you mentioned earlier about Jim Crow, eroding Jim Crow, that's where you have individuals, and then even apartheid in South Africa, where you have the CBC engaging in these different conversations, trying to see how can we link international struggle to domestic struggle. And I actually think in many ways, I think what Asha was saying, that it might have been like a lull with the CBC, with this engagement, and numerous other, I guess, Black thought leaders. In many ways, actually thinking about this current administration, where there's a rollback on a lot of different initiatives, it actually kind of opens a window in which you can kind of harken back to the days of actually seeing that if situation politically is unsettled here, looking for some form of alliance or some form of engagement with other type of allies. And I think there's actually, I know, for example, I'm thinking about the NAACP, they've actually done some work on climate change. But there's actually a window in which is open to look towards other allies and partners and thinking about, okay, how can we then form some form of solidarity, some form of alliance in trying to curtail whatever is being done domestically. One thing I'm thinking about, for example, I'm actually just thinking about trade. So I know Asha kind of talked about how there's been a scope for the CBC, primarily looking at Africa, the Caribbean. But I'm even thinking about, just the rise of China, where this is something where if you think about how can you focus on issues that impact Americans, in this case, African Americans, it is also looking beyond just issues of Africa and the Caribbean, but also looking at, okay, China in trade. We see Trump talked a lot about different trade and tariffs. But this is actually an avenue in which you can look at other aspects and see how it would directly relate back to working class Americans, African Americans, other type of groups.
You mentioned the NAACP, and do you think there are other Black civil society organizations that can play a role in this connection of the international engagement in international rules-based or values-based order with domestic issues at home? Mm-hmm. Others? Oh. Asha.
Yes, I mean, when you look at the foreign policy topics, they're already in some ways working on it. Mm-hmm. They just don't realize that, oh, that is a foreign policy topic, right? So when you look at economic security, with regards to the inflation issue, and they're like, yes, we're against the tariffs, right? Decision make, or the recent decision on tariffs. Well, that's a foreign policy issue. So some of it is that they're already working on it, they just don't realize it's a FP issue. And then there's some that it's lacking and that needs to be more incorporated as part of their agenda. And then, within a lot of these civil society organizations, there's not that many experts like us that are part of the leadership or part of the group that can educate them on making it part of their agenda, especially if these issues are disproportionately impacting us domestically. So, but yes, it applies across many places, right? I have a friend here who's from the Urban League. Would love to talk to her about potentially anti-gun violence, right? Mm-hmm. That's an issue, both nationally in terms of also foreign policy, where when it comes to gun violence in the Caribbean, that's connected back here at home. Yeah. So it's just a matter of educating and working together, bringing the two communities together. They just sometimes don't realize that it's a foreign policy topic.
Good. And I'll say the organization like the Global Black Economic Forum is seeding a lot of this work, looking at the interconnectivity around the global Black diaspora. There's well over 1 billion Black folk kind of spread across the globe, in part because of a legacy of colonialism and slavery and what have you. But you have, a large presence in, countries in South America, and like obviously there's Africa and obviously in Europe. And so they're trying to create interconnectivity to think about how they engage in economic lens. That work is being seeded.
Good. Tonija?
I was actually just in Medellin, Colombia this past weekend for one said gatherings. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of different things. The CBC and the members of Congress, I think, serve a really important role in making sure that connectivity is happening. I participated in a congressional delegation in March with 2 members of Congress to Brazil to do some fact-finding for the JPER agreement. I don't know if you all are familiar with JPER. It's a bilateral agreement that was signed between Brazil and the United States during the first Lula administration to work to promote racial equity in Brazil and the United States. A lot of focus tends to be on the Brazil part, but clearly we have a lot of work to do here. So, and in many ways, Brazil is far ahead of us because we seem to be regressing. They are progressing, and the members of Congress are making sure that that stays front and center. So I appreciate that through them and hope that that is able to continue.
I'm going to work in some of the questions into the framework that I have because they're right on point. There's one here, Richard, for you. These are questions from the audience which have come through to me. What are some of the main challenges that Black service members and veterans face, just to give people a more tangible sense of what are some of the issues that you're tackling through the project?
So I think if we just kind of start from recruitment to retirement, I think there are still very many challenges based around trying to get into kind of specific kind of roles in the military, special forces. There's such a dearth, whether it be getting into institutions like West Point. Now there's a curtailing even though the courts had decided that affirmative action would be maintained at the service academies, there's now an executive order to subvert that. So that has a direct correlation to the kind of senior leaders that we might see 20, 30 years from now, right? And so that's a starting point. I think that there's also kind of a defense industrial base, which I'm not an expert on, but I imagine Asha may be able to speak in more depth about, where there is a dearth of representation. There's a whole economy behind the military. There's a defense industrial complex that we know to be true, and Black folk are largely locked out of that economy. And so that is very, very much the case. And then with respect to Black vets, obviously, there's an ecosystem of benefits, whether it be education benefits, housing benefits, vocational training, disability compensation, and that ecosystem or that apparatus can provide a semblance of economic security that can sustain not only that Black veteran, but in large part a Black family. When you think about the disparities that existed with the initial GI Bill that ran from 1945 until 1956, it's estimated that the locking out of Black vets from accessing that landmark piece of social welfare legislation that essentially created the white middle class in America. It's estimated that there's about $4 trillion in lost economic wealth onto the Black community that has sustained itself over many decades. And then we're trying to connect that history to the present day where there are still systemic disparities that are perpetuating themselves. One clear example is in around PTSD compensation, to make it salient for folks. Some of our research was that we've been able to glean through our FOIA efforts was that there was a maintenance of a disparity around Black vets who were coming back from service over the course of the last few decades, applying for PTSD compensation and being unjustly denied for that compensation. Many of those denials were occurring in the Deep South where there is abject poverty, so they're returning back to resource-poor communities to begin with, and they're not receiving the mental health care that they have. That's why Black vets are twice as likely to live in poverty. And it's estimated that about 100,000 Black and Hispanic vets, and Puerto Rico actually has some of the lowest grant rates in the country around PTSD. And about 100,000 were unjustly denied because of the maintenance of these racial disparities to the tune of somewhere between $20 to $30 billion in lost compensation. That could have given them stability, but also has a direct correlation to a lot of the kind of social ills that we're seeing in society as well. So that's just to provide some semblance of color in like the through line between service to the present day, and also kind of the through line between being a service member to being a veteran too, because they're two different kind of ecosystems, but they're correlated.
Chris, I actually want to get into the issue which you've been working on a lot here at Carnegie, which is the views of Black Americans' understanding and interest in international affairs. There's traditionally been, you've talked about, I would say a preference for sort of, we would call it a judicious use of military force. and a preference for domestic versus, foreign spending. But given the ongoing conflict in Gaza, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and other, flashpoints in the world, does that remain true, do you think? Or is that evolving, I would say?
Oh, for sure, for sure. I guess before I get to that question, I'd like to just kind of tie that to the Black veteran perspective, in which, when we talk about, I guess, this tendency in African-American thought, African-American culture to kind of prefer a judicious use of military force abroad, it's in many ways informed by Black veterans. I'm just thinking about Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's the only person who voted against the authorization of use of military force. I mean, she is the daughter of a Vietnam vet. And then just several other, I can't name all the names, but several other individuals who I guess were kind of had questions about Cold War policy, were either veterans of the Korean War or the Vietnam War, or in particular the Second World War. So I think the Black veteran experience and returning back to the U.S., obviously thinking about Jim Crow segregation, but just thinking about what role does the U.S. play, and how does that put service members in harm, kind of influences that thought process. And kind of to get back to your original question, I mean, to be quite frank, I think like many Americans, I think the situation in Gaza and Ukraine is kind of this far off, I guess, a nebulous event for the average person. But I think it's interesting when you see these blips of interest in these conflicts. So I'm thinking about the African Methodist Episcopal Church. NAACP came out asking for an arms embargo. I think when you kind of see a interest, there's kind of a desire for some form of humanitarian aid, humanitarian concern, a concern for restraint, and just questions kind of being asked around, what is the trade-off for the role that the U.S. plays in the world. So I don't think that, for example, I think some individuals might think that, the African-American community is isolationist. I don't necessarily think there's a pullback from the world. I think it's just a question about, well, what role are we playing? And is it coming at a loss for, I guess, fulfilling some form of democracy, social democracy domestically?
And then
And I have to add on to this that I like what he said as far as it seems like a far away issue to them, because we've lost Black soldiers as a result of the Gaza crisis. And there was a lack of reaction from our community, lack of it. And I've seen, there were some media outlets that promoted it, but I didn't see a major reaction, right? So that's important to note.
And then taking it forward to the election, Chris, and others, obviously it's a much discussed electoral fact in the recent election that President Trump garnered a larger share of the African American vote than probably any Republican counterpart of his has in recent decades. Would you relate any of that to foreign policy views, or do you see that as primarily about domestic policy? I know it's kind of involves probably polling data that may not be available yet, but I'm curious. Any thoughts on that?
I'll speak to, I can only speak from my personal experience having family members who voted for Trump. I think that the Black community is just as susceptible to political propaganda as any other community, and so that, this is what it is. I do think that the immigration issue was understated. I do think that the issue in Gaza was understated as far as how much it would either make folks complacent or make them kind of switch parties. So I think all those factors kind of taken together are kind of informing in some respects kind of the outcomes that we're seeing.
Yeah, so Richard's right, and I would like to add on that as far as Black veterans or Black people that supported Trump, there was two factors, I must say, economic security, lack of economic prowess or goals that they were not really hearing from the other side, and also strength in terms of the next commander-in-chief, right? Some have just perceived that President Trump was stronger than the other candidates. So
yeah, Tonija, would you like to bring a younger person's you work with a lot of younger people to actually bring their perspective in, or your own?
Well, first I will just say that just to get into the details, that it was Black women were clear.
Yeah.
We were clear. It wasn't all Black people. It was Black men. because we were clear. On the young people, I don't know. I mean, you know, at Howard, our candidate was, I mean, the other candidate was from our institution, so that was, I mean, it was heavily, you know, in support of her. It's hard to gauge sitting from Washington, D.C. because we are like completely in a bubble.
Yes.
So it's hard to really feel how people are feeling when you sit in this place. But you know, our students were really very active and very vocal and very engaged on every level of this past election.
Chris, it sounds like something else occurring to you.
I mean, everyone's is on point. I think the only thing I would add is, I mean, I think you're right. Even for black men, if you compare it to other racial groups, I think it's like 79% of black men voted for Harris. I guess what I would say is I think it's more so an issue of like a deflated black vote. So yes, you know, President Trump captured 16% of the black vote. I think that's the highest since Nixon in 1960. You know, so on average, you have about 10% of African Americans vote for Republican regardless. So he probably gained about 6%. I think really the issue here is a deflated black vote. A lot of the data that I've seen.
Deflated black vote.
Oh, like,
just a decreased turnout among black
decreased
votes.
turnout, yes, thank you. Yeah, decreased turnout. Some of the data that I've seen, even coming out of like Democratic bastions like New York or even Philadelphia, especially like turnout, especially amongst working class folks. So individuals who I think are classified as making like less than $50,000 a year or no high school education only. The turnout decreased, in some cases 4%, 6%. So I think it's really an issue about a decreased turnout, but then tying it back to foreign policy, I mean, I'm personally of the belief that there is like this just general idea that if there is, while things are unsettled domestically and then you're seeing like what appears to be chaos or what appears to be America having, I guess, expanding security commitments, there's just this general disillusionment with the political system. So I think that's really more so what's at play more than just like Trump really kind of capturing a lot of black people.
Yeah. Staying on very current pressing concerns, obviously there's an extraordinary dismantling of DEI going on in this country across a very wide range of institutions. That's a big topic. We can't take it on all, but let's connect it to the question of the role of Black Americans in foreign policy. And how is the dismantling of DEI likely to affect or to weaken the operation of American foreign policy or America's engagement in the world more generally? How do we connect this line between this very striking and I would say disturbing domestic development to the international domain?
Well, I would say, you know, can't help it. I always have to think historically. I mean, I think we're kind of like in a witch hunt in many ways where I think the added value of African Americans in foreign policy is that they bring a different perspective. So I'll start with the Cold War, is that there a lot of individuals, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, were able to kind of make a space for like dissenting opinions, just able to kind of try to create a arena in which some people can critique or ask questions about Cold War policy. And I think McCarthyism kind of snuffed that out. And I'm thinking about today, I think that there is an added value of African Americans having various perspectives. I think one major perspective is this question of just kind of about being judicious about military force abroad. And I do think, I don't have a solution, but I do think this anti-DEI rollback is going to kind of snuff out a arena in which you're able to have open, honest debate, discussion, questions about foreign policy, where you may in many ways return back to a time in which you just kind of have like this binary thinking about how the world is to function and no nuance.
Please.
Great point. So I look at it two ways. It definitely limits the pool of consideration for specific, jobs or senior jobs. Like for instance, just the recent decision to no longer recruit Black engineers in the military at a prestigious institution is an example of that. So as far as that impact, I think it goes there. But I'm gonna be a little bit more optimistic here. Getting rid of the DEI programs is definitely an issue, but I will also say America has a history of just recovering and coming back, and I do believe it'll be restored in the future. But when it's restored, I think that we should take that opportunity to really make sure that DEI, that the Black community really benefits from DEI. Just looking at some of the statistics in terms of where we were before this big, movement, it could have been better as far as the benefits from DEI. And I think once it's being restored, I think we should definitely engage in more of an authentic discussion on how we can reap the benefits. Because when you rank us in terms of the benefits as far as DEI, comparing us to other subgroups, we're on the bottom. And we can do better in the future.
Richard, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm going to. Early in his time as Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth had a town hall meeting at the Pentagon, his first sort of town hall meeting. And early in that meeting, at least what I understand from what I read about it in the press, he said, "Our strength does not come through our diversity." And he was looking at a room full of people that was quite diverse in many ways. How do you think that went down among Black veterans?
Well, I think we've got to first understand how does he define strength, right? And then I think there has to be a more honest conversation about what the military has been, what the American project in fact is. It is a settler colonial white supremacist project, and we've been engaged in it for 250 years, and there's been a liberal order to try to maintain some semblance of stability through these DEI initiatives in order to try to force integration in some sense. And there's now want to be a return in a masked and politically propagandic way to resegregate. And so ultimately, I think when he says stuff like that, it makes me question how he defines strength, because in part, perhaps to the degree to which he views the military as an apparatus that to yield power, to pillage, and to the ends for folks to enrich the few, then certainly he's right. Diversity is not our strength. It doesn't need to be our strength. But to the degree to which we want to maintain a civil society, a multi-ethnic civil society, a multiracial civil society where there is opportunity and there is equity for the folks who participate in this society, the only way that this democracy is going to survive, you best believe diversity better be your strength. If you have the counter opinion, good luck maintaining this project. That's how I think about that.
Thank you. We have time I've been taking a few questions here, but there may be some questions here too. I think there's a microphone that could come in. Is that right? If somebody would like, you can just stand up and we'll bring the microphone to you. Would anyone like to come in with a question, or a comment is fine too? Yes, sir. And if you could identify yourself for the group.
I'm Mel Hardy from the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And, we're all observing what we're seeing. I'm concerned in my teaching practices about the role of creative institutions in peace building and conflict resolution. And I just wonder how one thinks about matters of these creative institutions in the foreign policy ecosystem, which I don't see. I'm trying to move it, but I don't see it extant in the foreign policy ecosystems as we see it today.
You say creative institutions?
Creative institutions like museums, library, Congress, we've got scholars there. Intellectual capital is depleted in the institution, but we don't deploy them.
It relates to a question that had come in here, I think, is in a different way. It says, it's a bit different, but how can we, in the face of the anti-DEI thrust, how can we preserve and protect progress in terms of the society you described, Richard, in the face of direct attacks on diversity, not just at the federal level, but in many other kinds of institutions in the country? These are big questions. We only have a little bit of time, but if you just have one.
And also they're difficult questions to answer when the entire apparatus of funding from the federal side is being, depleted, right? And so the ability to fund research libraries, intellectuals to be able to engage across countries, to resource share, and to also have those folks come to this country is going to be directly attacked, right? They can't get visas, they can't get scholarships, grants to their particular institutions are being undermined. USAID was one of the first major institutions to be attacked. And so I don't necessarily know if myself or anyone has the answers to such a big question just yet. But I do think that there is a big role for philanthropy to play in this particular moment, specifically because they benefit so greatly from tax breaks. So, and they have an apparatus and they have coffers. And I think that philanthropy in this particular moment seems, especially on the left, seems a bit both unresponsive and almost like crippled by what's happening. And they should be smarter about the ways in which they begin to engage in funding these types of opportunities. Yeah.
Thank you. Other question? Yes. So, yeah. Again, if you could identify yourself for the group, please.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been an interesting conversation. My name is Garvey Goldberg. I'm a Rangel Fellow at George Washington University. So kind of sitting nervously, but wanted to ask about something that was mentioned, and that was sort of the values of U.S. engagements, international engagements, and the debate surrounding those values, and the role of the CBC in upholding or revising those values as necessary and as applicable. And I kind of wanted to ask if you all could say more. So this is a question for all of our panelists. If you could say more about whether Black foreign policy leaders, like in the CBC, or I think this question could even be extended to Black foreign service officers, Black military leadership, leans more toward or has leaned more towards revising the values of U.S. international engagements or reinforcing them. I'm thinking of in cases like security in the CARICOM region, like in Haiti, where there's been support domestically for a multilateral intervention, but that could also be viewed through the lens of previous U.S. interventions in Haiti, which didn't go well. Even on immigration policy, I think in the CBC and in Congress and Democratic Congress in general, there's been a bit of a shift to more so focus on securing the border instead of addressing the reasons why people are migrating and the way the role the U.S. has played in that. So in terms of that, both that kind of difference between reinforcing those values, even if they might be problematic, and just kind of putting a black face behind reinforcing them, or actually changing those values, which do you see more of happening?
Can I just jump in? I think as a Rangel Fellow, you go through a particular, program. I think foreign service training in the U.S. has tended to happen at very specific institutions, none of which are HBCUs. I think that HBCUs have played a very important role in this conversation, as I was saying earlier, that is not always recognized, but I hope that through programs like Rangel Pickering that we run, that students who come from HBCUs and go into the foreign service or any of the fields that you mentioned are bringing that different perspective. As Chris was saying, historically, the issue was like decolonization, right? And so I think that even today, HBCUs, because HBCUs were created really with social justice at their core, I think that graduates of HBCUs in particular, graduate with that at the center of their being. And so my hope is that when we recognize that value that HBCUs bring, and then we send our graduates out into the foreign service and into these other fields, they are bringing that perspective. I don't have the statistics on if that's true or not, but that is my hope. That is what I'm working towards, because I think that that's the value that HBCUs bring to those bodies, but also those people then can spread it to others and hopefully have a multiplier effect.
Yeah, I mean, thought you were going to say something.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Chris.
Yes, I just wanted to address the principal piece where you said, is there, revising or going along with the traditional norms? Just based on within a year of working very closely with members of Congress in the CBC, they're open to revising some of these traditional norms. And it's a new phenomenon within the CBC. So I do see that they're more open-minded in terms of, the traditional norm is that we should support X, Y, and Z, but they're against that at times. And now they're trying to figure out how do we deliver that as a group. So that I'm hopeful in terms of that. But going back to the piece of Howard University and working very closely with foreign service officers, the issue with regards to our community as a whole is that there's a huge disconnect between what we got going on in academia versus the Congressional Black Caucus, then civil society, where when it comes to foreign policy, everybody just needs to come together and come to agreement as far as what is our Black agenda on foreign policy. It has not happened yet, but and also too, when you look at our community as a whole, they don't really do that as much, right? So I think for the most part moving forward, we need to get to that point where we have different stakeholders that come together to figure out what does that agenda look like.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think change is hard. I mean, our program, American Statecraft Program, we have a paper on strategic change, trying to kind of just change norms in foreign policy. I mean, I think it's extremely hard. I think there is a unique tension when it comes to African Americans and kind of voicing opinions that maybe counter what's the norm of Washington. I'm thinking about, once again, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was called un-American for her vote against the AUMF. So I think there is this, it's kind of an uphill battle to, still think about the U.S.'s role in the world and still voice it in a way in which is that I am committed, and you would say, to the American national project, that what I am voicing is not un-American or is not, I guess, counter-American values. So I think it does require not only interest from CBC, but I think it also requires a larger conversation about American society and understanding that any type of, I guess, opinion or thoughts about trying to modify or change norms is not, in fact, un-American, but is actually trying to see the best for America.
We just have 2 or 3 minutes, and it's almost a good closing note, Chris, because it's a good way to see it in a very broad perspective, but I want to bring the conversation back home, literally, in the sense I'd like to ask the advice of our guests. What can Carnegie or other institutions like Carnegie do to help increase ties between young people, African-American young people, and foreign policy, and facilitate greater engagement from this community? Can you have any specific suggestions for us?
Well, this is a good start, but it's February, and you do this in other months besides February. That would be great. I know that we have talked about doing things with our students here, so we look forward to partnering more with you all and getting students in here for internships, etc. Bringing some of your scholars over to Howard, or could all be steps to take.
Richard, any thoughts on this as way of closing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to speak to what's on my heart at this particular moment. I think, and it's kind of to the question that you were asking earlier, what I think foreign policy is ultimately just a mirror to what's happening internally. And what I think is ultimately transpiring from a values perspective that has always been a tension in this country is this tension between individualism and collectivism. And I think with respect to the Black community, there's always been a certain level of protection, collectivism for harm reduction in some respects, right? And there's a fundamental undermining of that right now, specifically on the right. They want folks to divest from the collective, to see themselves as a meritocratic individual kind of entity, disconnected and disjointed from any kind of collective project. That, to me, is the fundamental flaw that's happening. And so institutions like Carnegie have to decide which project are they ultimately dedicated to, because it goes beyond just whether it's a commitment to Black America. Black folks are Americans. Black Americans are Americans ultimately. And so is this a collective project that we are undertaking, or are we going to engage and continue to engage in this farce of individualism, which is ultimately at the heart of what the right is trying to do, which ultimately just benefits few people to the expense of the vast majority. So.
Asha, closing thought. We just have 1 minute. So,
Yes,
yeah.
I kind of mentioned it before. If Carnegie wants to do something, I think they should help us develop a strategy in bringing, and the desired outcome is to create an agenda as far as what are our priorities, our principles when it comes to Black America and foreign policy. And then as far as bringing in the people to help develop it, that should come across from so many, across the spectrum in terms of different stakeholders. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone Columbia grad veterans, right? It could be someone from the Urban League or somewhere else, right? That can help feed into that. You know, because the domestic perspective is critical right now. I just wanted to mention real quick what we saw in the last 2 years as far as a reaction on foreign policy issues within our community and outside is that why is that Ukraine, Israel, all these countries are getting all this aid, but I can't even, I don't get any aid or no one's paying my student loans, right? And some of it is just a failure of the administration or the government communicating to them, so we could walk and chew gum at the same time, or it's just not result driven, right, as of now. So there needs to be an engagement with those, especially in the domestic arena, as far as developing a strategy and communicating with them as far as what does our agenda look like.
I want to thank our hardworking panelists for bringing this conversation through so many different topics. I want to thank Chris for putting this together and for his work here, and the Statecraft Program for sponsoring this, and all of you for taking part. We look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Good job.